evaluation. Another year, I'll ask members at large to do it. And a third year, I'll ask outsiders to do it, to sort of sneak in here and worship with us and then give their critique. And I have found in doing it that good, objective, mature critique is extremely beneficial to me on a number of grids. One is when you get 6 or 10 or 12 people that ordinarily don't run in the same circles, and they evaluate you and the church, and they say the same thing, wise is the pastor that will notice that and listen to it. A lot of times what happens each year when I ask for this is I will get responses that only confirm what I have been sensing myself, either concerns or places I should push the church, but are tentative to do so. But when I get these responses, they're the sort of push I need, that, the Holy Spirit may be at work here, if enough people are saying the same thing. Other times, if I live to be 100 years old, I would never think of some of the critique that I get. It's just not something I think about. And to get it helps me to sort of think in a different perspective that other people might have. All that to say, good, objective, mature critique, if it's done correctly, actually pushes you to excel. And we never stop learning. So what I'm going to ask beginning next week, over the next few months, is for you to join me as a collective body in evaluating the state and health of Calvary Baptist Church. Now, because I know many of you well, I know it already automatically, some of you, they've already checked out saying, that makes me uncomfortable, I don't like that, people get their feelings hurt, okay, I'll prepare. So let me take it a little further. Some of you might but it still says the same thing. And you of now. To give you a historical background so you know what's going on in the entire book of Revelation. When you talk about wars and blood and dragons from the sea, it's all steeped in what's going on in the first century. And what is going on in the first century is under Nero, if you remember him, playing the fiddle while Rome burned, which is a little bit urban legend, but anyway, that's a whole other church history tomorrow, next Sunday starting at 9:30. Nero's persecution and the was sporadic. It was systematic. He was deliberate in targeting Christians. Nero was limited to the city of Rome. The mission throughout the world. And when John says throughout the world, he means the Roman Empire. Which included the province of Asia, where the seven churches were. We'll talk about this later in his letter, when he gets into this sort of apocalyptic language, all about the persecution that they now are experiencing. Were personally slandered publicly for being imprisoned, and others were being executed. Imagine an entire government using at their expense the military, the police, the courts to go after Christians. Not hard to imagine, but that's what's happening in John's letter of Revelation. There is persecution throughout. And so the question is, could these little seven churches survive the storm of global persecution or persecution in the Roman world? So persecution is a big deal in John, not only in chapter 2 and 3, but going throughout. If you read Revelation, you're going to find a lot of vigilant, adversarial persecution, violent imagery, because it's going on in John's churches. There is another predominant issue going on in, and that is not only persecution by an outside world, but predominant, which you'll in the mid I won't use it here, but it's a big heresy started by Marcion, Christian. So it came into the church. The gospel of Jesus in their doctrine, to be tainted with error. And John will write not only in chapter 2 and 3 to these churches, but goes on later, deeper in the letter. That's John's real goal. John writes, a third problem is rank sin, particularly immorality among leaders and church people at large. They are lowering the bar of what it means to act like a Christian. And there's all sorts of rank immorality. Persecution, error, and sin are the big issues that the seven churches are all dealing with on that province that John writes about and concerning. Later, John will talk about an image of a dragon in the book of Revelation. Not Pete's dragon, John's dragon. The dragon, which John says the beast of the earth, which John describes as the false teaching or false teacher. Third is the Babylon harlot, which is depicted as immoral sin. Persecution, error, and immorality is permeating John's churches. And so the question is, will they survive this onslaught? The devil's tactics are the same. Today, Calvary Baptist Church has to deal with a government outside entities that are persecuting Christians. Some of it is overt, some of it is subtle. Some of it happens in businesses, others now in education. Some of it happens in relationships that you have personally. Others happen on social media, of boycotting and banning and saying the Christians are accused of hate crimes. Just this week, an elected representative of our federal government had the temerity to compare Christians to the Taliban in this country. And so persecution looms in our day, as does error. It seems like more and more, you can ask the other elders, but I don't remember a time in my 26-year pastoral ministry where we as genuinely concerned shepherds deal with as much error. I'm not saying rampant Calvary, thank God, but that our people are asking questions about because it's out there and maybe getting closer to 8130 Lackman. I mean, from time to time you deal with one, you'll deal with two, but it seems like a gushing dam. You plug it here and then there's 18 errors happening over here. It's happening at such a rapid rate that is undermining the gospel. And finally, sin. It seems now that every season a prolific leader of the faith is either walking away from the faith or has been disqualified by it because of rank sin. And even Christians that I know, Christians that you know, that once upon a time we benefited from their presence in our lives, are now checking out of the Christian faith altogether. Rank sin. So we are no different, you see, than the first century age of persecution, error, and sin. So the messages that John gave to these 7 churches is a message that we can benefit from today. It is a call to endure tribulation, as John will repeatedly say in this letter. Endure tribulation. Endure suffering for the gospel. That's an exhortation. A second that is dominant in this letter is resist the enticements of the devil. And finally, obey the commandments of God, all targeting these 3 tactics. It is a revelation through John, it is a revelation to the church, and finally, and most importantly, we need to hold on to this one, it is a revelation of Jesus Christ. If the recipients of this letter of Revelation are the churches of Jesus, then the substance is Jesus himself. In fact, the book begins by describing it that way. It doesn't say the revelation of beasts. It doesn't say the revelation, this talks all about the Middle East in this age, and Russia, and all this sort of nonsense. Where did we come up with this nonsense? It's like grabbing a fortune cookie and hoping it works. No, the clarity is revelation of Jesus Christ. The book begins by describing Jesus, and John circles back at the end, in the last 2 verses of Revelation are talking about Jesus Christ being center stage now and forevermore. To call it the revelation of John is a bit misleading. It is a revelation of Christ, which is exactly what those churches needed during times of trial, and it's exactly what we need. A church with its back against the wall, fighting for its survival in an open and hostile world needs more than moral exhortations, and it certainly needs more than charts about how you've timed the Lord's return. That helps nobody in comfort. Jesus helps, and Jesus is what we need. When Jesus is first introduced by John, he is given an impressive list of 3 titles that, if, as you study Revelation, come back over and over again in this letter. First, and all are mentioned, by the way, in verse 5. First, he is the faithful witness. Now, Jesus came into the world. Did Jesus suffer for his cause? Hello? Did Jesus suffer for his cause? Of course. Yeah, we got this little thing called the cross, right? Was Jesus faithful to the end in tribulation? John calls him this. This is on his resume. And John's point is the church walks in lockstep with her Lord. And if Jesus was faithful to the end in being the witness for his cause, the church, no matter how rough we have it in this world, should remain faithful to the end. Second, he is called in verse 5, the firstborn of the dead. Others have been brought back to this life, but he was the first to enter a new and indestructible one. Others have returned to life only to die again. But Jesus, according to verse 18, is alive forevermore and is now called the living one. A persecuted church that faces the possibility of death, which is what the 7 churches faced with. One of the great hopes for that church and ours is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ lives forevermore, and death itself could not stop him. It is the same hope for us today. Jesus is still the firstborn of the dead. Third, and finally, in verse 5, he is the ruler of the kings on earth. It's impressive that John would say this as they are suffering under the hands of Domitian, as he writes this. Earthly kings seek to crush the church, to stamp it out. Earthly kings see Christians as a pest that society would be well to be rid of. But Jesus is the King of kings and the Lord of lords who directs the affairs of all men. When John, later in this chapter, sees a vision of the church, he is given a vision to transmit it to others. Verse 11, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches. So at the beginning of each of these 7 letters, Christ announces himself as the original author and describes himself by one or more features already revealed with these titles in this chapter. Now in verse 12, when John turned around and saw the vision, it was the lampstands that was in his vision that he saw first. He did not see a candelabrum consisting of one lampstand with 7 branches. This is, again, another misnomer that, wizards of smart think they've got. The candelabrum with 7 branches you would see in the tabernacle. But John sees 7 separate lampstands, and they're lit. And no quicker does he see them than he sees Jesus is standing in the midst of them. So already we're into this symbolic, allegoric language. And so we need to understand meaning. And Jesus gives us the meaning. Verse 20. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, and the 7 stars of the angels of those 7 churches. Now, what angels mean is of another time and place. Angels, translated simply messengers, can be earthly, messengers, preachers, pastors of these churches, or it can be heavenly angels, but that's for another day. What we know for sure is these 7 lampstands are the 7 churches that radiate light. And what John is getting to, as long as Jesus is in the middle of these churches, they radiate light. But when Jesus leaves them, their light goes out. It is a lesson that John will carry over to the churches of in chapter 2 and 3 to be sure you have Christ in the middle of your church, that Christ's presence is there. That is the only fuel that radiates light to a dark world. And it's the same message for us. Calvary Baptist, our light shines to the degree that Christ is present with us. If He walks out the back door, then our light, no matter how often we meet, our light goes out. So He is, again, propping up the supremacy of Jesus. What Christ thinks of Calvary Baptist, what He thinks of the church in Smyrna, Thyatira, Pergamum, Philadelphia, Laodicea, and on is very important. He has the right to think what he thinks and say what he says. In the first place, it's His church. He founded it with His blood, as we sang a moment ago. In the second place, He knows us intimately. This is an amazing thing. That's why He's our chief shepherd. Now, one of the luxuries of being a pastor, of your pastor, coming up on 17 years, there are some benefits I have of being your pastor 17 years that I may not have had in 17 weeks. 17 years means that most of you have come after me. So you're the only pastor that you've known at Calvary Baptist Church. I'm the only pastor you've known at Calvary Baptist Church. And there's a certain benefit to that. I remember Dr. John MacArthur, I'll never forget this, at a Shepherd's Conference years ago, and he talks about how his first 7 years at his church was horrific. In fact, he calls it Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday happened to him in his 7th year when 25% of the staff quit on him, and a lot of the old leadership didn't want to follow John MacArthur's leadership. And he was asked about this. He said, well, why did you stay? He said, it was just sheer, I just outlived them. He said, a lot of them were old, and I knew that more new people would come in. I would just outgrow them and outlive them, and then I could do what I wanted. And in his 10th year, sure enough, he did. And my point is, in 17 years, there's certain benefits. There's other things that are more difficult now, but 17 years is beneficial in a lot of ways. One is that if you're a member of Calvary Baptist Church, I know a little bit about you. I know a little bit about everybody in this church, and you know me. And so the benefit of that is there's trust, and you care and you love, and I know who, for example, I can say what to in a certain way. I know that I can be firm and put my foot down and get in some people's face if I feel like they need to. And a lot of others I couldn't do that because, they would shrivel up and I'd hurt their feelings. And it's all about knowing your sheep. To have Jesus say what He says here is marvelous, but He can say it as the chief shepherd. One of the prolific attributes about Jesus here in chapter 1, 2, and 3 is that He knows the church intimately. I know is going to be very important because when John dispatches every seven letters to 7 separate churches, they all begin with Jesus saying, I know you. It will be different on what He says later, but they all start with, I know. To some he'll say, I know your works, your labor, your patient endurance. To another church he'll say, I know your tribulation and your poverty. To another church he'll say, I know where you dwell. To another church he'll say, I know your love and service. And over again, every church starts off with, I know. Here is John's picture. Jesus stands among the lampstands. He is walking and patrolling and supervising and overseeing his churches. The risen Christ lays emphasis either in rebuke or in exhortation in one particular characteristic of the church. So, as we begin our journey next week, beginning with church number 1, each one tell us exactly what Christ thinks of his church. And Calvary Baptist Church, in so doing, the next couple of months, walking out of here, we are going to know exactly what Jesus Christ thinks about us. Father, I thank you for